Alright, so I never really pictured myself putting together a video of my solve or my answers to the clues, especially while the hunt was going on, mostly because I felt like I had figured out a few things that put me at a unique advantage to find the thing. And I figured if anyone else were to ever find it, that it would only be a matter of time before we would have some answers to where it was found and how it was found. Unfortunately, we're kind of sitting here in the dark without any answers, stuck looking at pictures of pine cones, trying to figure out where on earth this thing might have been. I like to think that if I was the one who found it, I would have thrown a bone to the search community and given them some indication of the general area of where it was found, and I would follow that up with what I believe would be a book that would lay out the whole solve in all of its glorious detail. But, I'm not the one who found it, so I don't get to make those calls. Just a little background on how I got involved in the treasure hunt. Back in the spring of 2018, I found out I'd be moving to Colorado for work, and I had a buddy who had been looking out at Dinosaur National Monument a number of times, and so we got to talking one night, and it was only a matter of time before I was online reading the poem, looking at maps, and probably like every other person who's ever looked for this thing, started developing these delusions of grandeur that the only thing that this treasure hunt was lacking was being graced by the presence of my intellect. And of course that idea was humbled the first time I went out looking and arrived at my spot, ready to snatch the treasure up and put it in my bag and walk home and glorying in my own wisdom. I had to get humbled multiple times going out and looking for this thing. And over the course of the first year, I had a number of solves that were mostly around the Royal Gorge area on the Arkansas River in Colorado. There was a brief period of time where I was looking into an area out by Kerwin in Wyoming. And ultimately, after that first year, I had been met with enough frustration that I decided that I was either going to give this thing up or I was going to go back to the drawing board, start from the beginning, and take a closer look at the first clue, where warm waters halt, which is what Forrest has always said that we should do. And so I went about doing that, and I looked into a couple of the things Forrest has actually said about the location of the treasure, and particularly where warm waters halt. And he said, in this particular instance, he said, there are a few words in the poem that are not useful in finding the treasure, but it is risky to discount any of them. You oversimplify the clues. There are many places in the Rocky Mountains where warm waters halt, and nearly all of them are north of Santa Fe. Look at the big picture. There are no shortcuts. Now, this would be easy to read and just to glance over and carry on with whatever notion you had of where warm waters halt as you did before, but there's a couple important things he says here. First of all, he says there are many places in the Rocky Mountains where warm waters halt, which suggests that warm waters halt itself is a concept or phenomenon, and that the place where we need to start is an instance of that phenomenon. And we need to keep in mind that this phenomenon or concept occurs at least once in a place that is not north of Santa Fe. He also says to look at the big picture. Now, this is something I think was vastly ignored by the search community, because you look at many people's warm waters halts, they were random hot springs, or they were random places with a name that sounds warm, for example, Ojo Caliente. I'm not sure, maybe people had a way of tying that into some big picture idea, but I don't see any logical way that you can do that. There's another quote that's along similar lines, not specifically referring to where warm waters halt, but maybe the chase as a whole. And he says, the only requirement is that you figure out what the clues mean, but a comprehensive knowledge of geography might help. Once again, he's hinting at needing to look at a big picture in order to figure this thing out. And so I decided I was going to approach this brand new approach to the chase was going to be with this big picture concept in mind. And the first thing I decided I needed to figure out was what the word halt means, because something that always bothered me as I started looking for this was the idea that water and how it could halt. Because on a molecular level, at least in its liquid form, water never really halts, at least not with the default interpretation of the word halt, which would be an object in motion coming to a rest or a stop. And so I looked up potential alternative interpretations of the word halt. And one of them was particularly interesting to me. It's definition 2 right here in the Merriam-Webster. It says, to be in a state of uncertainty or doubt between alternate courses or choices. I found that interesting because it doesn't have much to do with an object coming to a rest. It has implications, though, because when you read Forrest's book, and I had already read through Forrest's book once when I kind of restarted my approach on this, and throughout his book, he kind of touches on this concept, intentionally or not. He talks about, as a kid, not really knowing what to do next, not knowing where to go. He talks about in important literature, imagining what it would be like if, had he gone to college, or how, he might have been a great writer or a great something other than that. He always seems to be considering the alternatives and how a certain series of events led him down the path that he went down in his life. And so that was an interesting definition to me. And so I went back and read the book all over again, kind of looking for hints at a big picture that we should be looking at. And in the very first official chapter of the book in important literature, in the second paragraph, there's something that kind of caught my eye. He says, so one day when it was raining, I went to Borders to see about those books. Now, I thought it was interesting that he felt the need to include the weather that was going on outside when he went to the bookstore. I also thought it was interesting that he specifically went to Borders bookstore. I mean, he sold his book at the Collected Works bookstore. You would think that would be an opportunity to give that bookstore a shout out. Maybe this is a true story about Forrest going to the bookstore and reading these books and finding Catcher in the Rye. Or maybe this entire chapter was fabricated to set some themes or to give some cryptic hints. It's hard to say. But what's interesting is a couple pages later in the same chapter, he says, at Borders the next day, it was still raining, so I just wandered around the store. So here we have two spots in the first chapter of his book where he associates Borders and raining. Now maybe that's a non-clue, but I thought it was interesting enough that maybe rain has something to do with the solution, and maybe Borders has something to do with the solution. Not the bookstore, but the concept of Borders. And I thought, okay, well, how can I apply this to a big picture? And how can I use Borders and rain to find a place where warm waters halt? Well, the easy initial interpretation of this would be that rain might have something to do with warm waters, that warm waters might simply be rain. We spend all this time looking on a map for geothermal features in lakes and rivers, looking for warm waters. Maybe warm waters is just the general concept of rain. And then I thought, okay, well, how can I use that definition how can I use that idea along with my newfound definition of halt, or being in a state of uncertainty or doubt between alternate courses or choices, and apply it all to some big picture. And so I started asking myself, well, what's the big picture of water? And the thing that came to mind was the water cycle. You learned about it in elementary school. Water evaporates from the ocean, goes up into the clouds in the form of condensation, and then falls to the earth in precipitation, following tributaries, streams, and then rivers, and then major rivers back to the ocean, and it does it over and over again. And how could I use that water cycle and find something on land that would give me a starting point? Well, I thought about watersheds. And what are watersheds but a region of land where if a raindrop falls anywhere within that region, it'll eventually drain into the same major river system. And so I looked up this map of watersheds on National Geographic. And this is a neat little interactive map here that shows, the different major watersheds throughout the United States. So in the Rockies, we have the Missouri Regional Watershed, which encompasses much of Montana and Wyoming. You have the Pacific Northwest Regional Watershed, which is on the west side of the Continental Divide, but contains some of the Surge area. You have the Great Basin, which touches part of southwest Wyoming. You have the Upper Colorado, which touches much of Wyoming, much of Colorado, some of New Mexico. You have the Rio Grande, which touches part of southern Colorado and New Mexico. And then you have the Arkansas, which is Colorado and New Mexico as well. And so I started wondering, okay, well, in the context of rain, what borders are important? Well, it's these watershed borders. And so I thought, okay, well, what if a drop of rain lands right on the border between the Arkansas watershed and the Missouri? Then that drop of rain will be in a state of uncertainty or doubt between alternate courses or choices. That drop of rain has to decide if it's going to drain towards the Missouri or drain towards the Arkansas. And the same is true of any of these borders. And so I started to feel like I was onto something, but I didn't have a lot of precision in terms of finding a starting point, because these borders, there's multiple borders, and they go on for hundreds of miles. And so there's got to be more to it than that. And I know a lot of people had suggested the Continental Divide might be where warm waters halt for similar reasons, but the Continental Divide runs all along these different watershed borders and doesn't give us a precise starting point. And so I thought, okay, well, what if we were to try to, if we were to use these borders to get to a specific spot, we would need to find a place where more than one borders meet. For example, we have up here a place where the Pacific Northwest Regional Watershed meets the Missouri Regional Watershed and meets this other smaller watershed up here. If it will let me select it, the Source Red Rainy Watershed. So there's a spot right here just east of Glacier National Park where those three meet. There's another spot down here near Jackson, Wyoming, where these three watersheds meet. And again here in southwest Wyoming where these three meet. Again in Colorado where these three meet. And again in southern Colorado where these three meet. And I started looking into these specific locations, and it turns out that a lot of them are named for that reason. This spot right here is precisely at a spot named Triple Divide Peak, and this one down here near Jackson is named Three Waters Mountain. This one down here is named Commissary Ridge. This one down here is named McNamee Peak. This one down here is named Headwaters Hill. And then you have one that's directly west of Santa Fe, right here in New Mexico. And so here we have 6 total locations where 3 watersheds meet at one spot in the Rocky Mountains, and 5 of them are north of Santa Fe, which fits Forrest's initial quote here. There are many places in the Rocky Mountains where warm waters halt, and nearly all of them are north of Santa Fe. And this is encompassing a big picture of water. So this is a very, very nice fit for what Forrest said in that particular quote. And so I started looking into these individual locations to see if there was any additional evidence that maybe this was the spot, a spot where you would find a Home of Brown and a No Place for the Meek and a Blaze and so forth. And as I started looking into these individual spots, one of them in particular caught my eye. And so I'm going to show you on this map the place that was interesting to me. If you zoom in on this spot, and we're actually going to lose our borders here, but it'll keep the highlighted one selected. But when we zoom into this spot where the Upper Colorado meets the Missouri meets the Arkansas River watershed, there was something interesting that stood out from the others. And so this is the spot right here that we lost the borders as we zoom in, but this is the spot right here, this point. And as we zoom into this, it's just northeast of Leadville. We can see that this spot is right in the center of a perfect little double omega in the landscape formed by the rivers. And so I looked into this spot more closely on other maps, particularly this map here, the topo map. And as we can see, the double omega looks a little bit more apparent here. So here's the spot where warm waters halt. Here's our double omega. And when I zoomed in to find out precisely what this spot was, I found this place called McNamee Peak. So here we have the Continental Divide running this way, which divides the watersheds from the east and the west. And then we have another Continental Divide running this way on Ceresco Ridge. And so what we have here is we have a watershed running this way, a watershed running this way, and then a watershed running this way. Right in the middle is McNamee Peak, right in the middle of that double omega. And I thought that was a pretty interesting find. I thought maybe I was onto something. Here is the area on Google Maps. And so going back to the topo map, a couple other evidences for this being the spot. So you see right here, just below, over in a spot that you can overlook from McNamee Peak, there is a glory hole. This is part of the Climax molybdenum mine, where they mine this molybdenum stuff, and the glory hole is located right here. And if you might recall, in one of Forrest's scrapbooks, I think it was the one talking about playing football, the very first line of this scrapbook is, "Glory is where you find it." Now that could just be some random thing Forrest said, or he might be referring to Warm Waters Halt. Another thing that I found interesting, so I looked up the name McNamee because I had never heard that name before to see what it meant. And the meaning of it is Hound of Meath. Meath is a place in Ireland, and it's a reference to an Irish foxhound. Now that was particularly interesting because I had previously looked up the origin of the phrase "the thrill of the chase." I always felt like Forrest, might have included some sort of hint in the title of the book itself. And while we commonly use the phrase "the thrill of the chase" in the context of treasure hunting, hunting in general, or chasing after women or what be it, the actual origin of that phrase is fox hunting. So here we have a place that fits the definition of where warm waters halt. We have it centered right in the middle of two omegas, and we have a place that's named for fox hunting. Just like and so we have evidence for this in the title of the book. We have evidence for it on the last page of the book with the double omega, and we have a place that's a big picture, warm waters halt. Pretty good fit in my opinion, but I wanted to find more evidence for this. So one of the clues that Forrest, or at least Douglas Preston, said Forrest was going to leave with his original plan where he was going to go die with the chest, is that Forrest was going to park his car at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and that was going to be a clue. So I started looking into that possible clue, and I wanted to look at exhibits that were present at the museum, and under the hunch that maybe one of these exhibits might be an artifact or something found close to where the treasure would be hidden. And so I figured I would look at permanent exhibits, since these would be the ones that would be likely to stand the test of time as a clue. And there's a section of permanent exhibits where the gems and minerals section. And just the description here, I'll go ahead and read it. So it says, "Grab your hard hat. In Core's Gems and Minerals Hall, follow the mine shaft into a Mexican silver mine, where a cavern glistens with milky white gypsum crystals and stalactites. Then enter Colorado's own Sweet Home Mine to discover a 6-foot wall of beautiful red rhodochrosite crystals." So I started looking into this Sweet Home Mine and these rhodochrosite crystals. It's where they found the best sample ever in the world of a rhodochrosite crystal called the Alma King, named after the town of Alma, located near it. And I decided maybe this might be the Denver Museum clue. And so I went to my Warm Waters Halt and I typed in Sweet Home Mine. And well, lo and behold, it's located just a couple of miles from McNamee Peak. So here's our double omega, here's the Sweet Home Mine, and here's McNamee Peak right here. Maybe that's the Denver Museum clue. I don't know. And so I kept reading the book, and there was another chapter where there seemed to be some evidence for my Warm Waters Halt. And it's in My War for Me, and it's in the part where Forrest is on a combat mission, and he's flying over a group of people, and he's getting ready to fire on them, and then he realizes it's a funeral. And so he says here, I'll just read from the book, it says, "It was a funeral. We were traveling so fast, no one had heard us coming. And when I rolled my wing down, I could see Nothing but panic and yelling and screaming and stampeding and terrible fear. It was horrible. Women were running with babies in their arms. Children had started fleeing in every direction with their arms up as if they were surrendering. One old, bearded man with 2 walking sticks just looked at me as if he were resolved to meet his fate. So I want to, before I carry on to the next paragraph, I want to go back and focus on the old man with the beard. So this old man had 2 walking sticks, and he was resolved to meet his fate. And when I pictured an old man standing there with 2 walking sticks, kind of with his arms out, it kind of puts the image in my mind of an old man making double omegas with his arms. And it says this man was resolved to meet his fate. Now let's think back to this definition of halt that I had. It's to be in a state of uncertainty or doubt between alternate courses or choices. To be in a state of uncertainty or doubt between alternate fates. So here we have this old man making a double omega with his arms, resolved to meet his fate. And the next paragraph that follows is what's very interesting to me. He says, I was so ashamed I started crying in my oxygen mask, sobbing. I could hardly see through the dark visor on my helmet, and the salty tears burned my eyes in a way I had not known for a long time. Suddenly, I hated Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara and all of the other politicians who were sitting in their fat offices at home, totally oblivious to what war was really like. And so here Forrest is crying, and the salty tears burn his eyes. Now, tears are awfully similar to rain, and these tears burned his eyes. I think this is giving us a hint that tears and rain might be warm waters. And he says, following that, he says, suddenly I hated Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara. Now, the name McNamara stood out to me, and I didn't discover this passage until after I had discovered McNamee Peak as warm waters halt. But the name McNamara sounded awfully similar to McNamee. In fact, the first 6 letters of McNamara share the same 6 letters with McNamee. And so I decided, what the hell, I'll look up the name McNamara, see what that means. I know McNamee means Hound of Meath, but what does McNamara mean? Well, it turns out in Irish it means Hound of the Sea. Very similar meaning. So here we have, within 2 paragraphs, we have Forrest talking about an old man making a double omega resolved to meet his fate, matching our definition of halt and our double omega. We have tears or rain, and then we have the name McNamara, which means Hound of Meath, which goes back to the title, The Thrill of the Chase. McNamara means Hound of the Sea, but McNamee means Hound of Meath. And I started to look further into these Irish surnames, and I found that McNamara, not only is it similar to McNamee, it's directly above McNamee in terms of alphabetically listed Irish surnames, and this is a comprehensive list of names right here. So very interesting stuff there. So that right there is most of the evidence I had for potential evidence for warm waters halt. But there's one other thing I found that maybe it's a little out there, but I thought it was worth sharing. So in the chapter Buffalo Cowboys, if you recall, Forrest and his brother and his friend, they went chasing after this buffalo, Cody, and then their car got dragged into this stream, and their car came to a stop, and they went flying off the car, and the buffalo ran away with the front axle of the car. And I thought that was interesting, but when I was looking into this watershed map, I couldn't help but feel that the outline of the Upper Colorado watershed and the outline of the Arkansas watershed, which are 2 of the borders that are involved in my warm waters halt, looked an awful lot like a car being pulled by a buffalo. Now, it's hard to see on this map, but if I show you here back on our watershed map, let's zoom back out here. And I'll show you that. So here's the Arkansas watershed. Now let's zoom back into this. So you can't tell me that this doesn't look a little bit like a buffalo here. Let's see if I can get rid of this. Okay, so right here you have the head. Here you have the little beard of the buffalo. Here you have the hoof. Here you have the tail. Here you have the hump. I don't know. I think that looks a lot like a buffalo. And then you come over here and you have the Upper Colorado. You have the shape of a car here with the wheels. And then you have 3 people on top. And if we go back to that picture one more time, that's what we have. We have 3 people. We have the wheels. We have a buffalo. I don't know. That's a bit out there. I'm not like hinging my entire solve on this, but I think it's at least worth showing. So moving forward from the first clue. So we have Warm Water's Halt. Now, some people might say, well, how do you start at Warm Water's Halt if it's on top of a mountain? We have this mountain peak. This is like 13,000 feet high. How can this be the start of Warm Water's Halt? And I take you back to the first stanza. He says, as I have gone alone in there. As I've gone alone in there. What does he mean by that? Maybe he's talking about the cockpit of his airplane. I'm going to show you a couple of quotes that are interesting. So, alone in there, in my theory, is in his airplane. And that's why the first stanza is there to put you in that mindset. He says, my favorite flights were those when I headed alone and at 200 feet into the teeth of the Rockies, not knowing or caring where I would land. My least favorites were the 2 occasions when I lost my engine and was fortunate to find runways to land on. That was from 6 Questions in 2019. And then in My War for Me, there was another part where he says, when he's flying over Philadelphia, he says, I remember the air was quiet, even over the large populated areas. No one was around. No one was on the radio. No one to talk to. The impersonal lights were there, but I was all alone. Pretty good evidence there for as I have gone alone in there, referring to his cockpit. And so maybe Warm Water's Halt is something you fly over. Maybe he wants you to look at this in the reference of you're flying in a plane, at least for the first part of the poem. So that's why McNamee Peak, in my opinion, still works for that. And so, okay, so we fly over McNamee Peak. What comes next? He says, begin at where Warm Water's Halt and take your airplane, and the canyon down. Not far, but too far to walk. And that's what I'm coming to next, is what too far to walk might mean. And so first of all, I had to figure out the canyon down. I mean, there's all kinds of canyons here. There's a canyon, there's this moving north. You can move south from here. This is actually the top of the Rockies Highway right here, moving down into Leadville. So that seemed like a decent canyon down coming down this way. And he says, not far, but too far to walk. Well, it turns out right here you have a Highway 24 that runs down through Leadville and then exits out of Leadville, goes south to Buena Vista, and then goes east towards Colorado Springs. And a lot of my previous solves were kind of in between Colorado Springs and like the Woodland Park, Florissant area, where I was using Highway 24 as my solution for too far to walk. And so I was well aware of Highway 24, and it was actually hard for me to go away from that initially with some of my other solves, but I thought, okay, maybe Highway 24 is too far to walk, but what's the evidence for that? Well, there was one clue that Forrest gave multiple times, and I'm just going to show you on Terry Scant here. When you type in Toledo on Terry Scant, you get a whole list of times where Forrest talks about the treasure being 300 miles west of Toledo. This is a clue people have endlessly speculated about, whether or not it's even a clue. But what's interesting is the first time he ever brought up Toledo, he said it was 300 miles southwest of Toledo, or more than 300 miles southwest of Toledo. And every other occasion he always used west, but the initial quote was southwest of Toledo. And on a total hunch, on a pure speculation, I thought, what if Highway 24, what if there's some bizarre chance that this highway goes through Toledo, Ohio, and that's what the Toledo clue is. And so I looked up Highway 24. Here's a map of Highway 24. It starts up in Colorado, and it moves northeast through the Midwest and up into Michigan. And in the first paragraph here on Wikipedia, it says, the western terminus is at Minturn, Colorado, at an intersection with I-70. The highway transitions from north to south to east to west signage in Toledo, Ohio. So not only does this highway go through Toledo, Ohio, but it actually transitions from north-south to east-west. The treasure is more than 300 miles west of Toledo, in Toledo, freaking Ohio. And when I found this is when I really realized I might have been onto something. But that's not where the evidence for Highway 24 stops. So if you go to the chapter Gold and More, Forrest talks about his string collection, right? I'm just going to read that passage in the book. He says, "Then I started collecting string, and no kind or color was immune to my desire for it, but most pieces were white. The best saving technique was to tie one end of the new piece of string onto the end of the last one. I knew all of the good tricks, and one was to tie only square knots so they wouldn't slip. Soon I had a multicolored ball that got larger and larger with each tie-on. I hoped to tie on at least 3 strings a day, and after a year or so the ball was so large it couldn't go through my bedroom door. Then one afternoon, when I walked home from school in the rain," he walked home from school in the rain, "my string had disappeared. It just wasn't there anymore. I tried to explain to my mother that since the ball couldn't get out of my room, it was somewhat difficult for anyone else to steal it. She didn't answer, but just kept nodding and looking out the window. I think she was watching for the postman or something. Even to this day, the mystery of what happened to my string ball remains one of the great unsolved crimes in my family." I've seen a lot of people speculate that the ball of string is in some way a hint, but it wasn't until I started looking into Highway 24 that I discovered what that hint was, and I'm going to show you that right here. So, like I said, my warm waters halt is up here at McNamee Peak. You're going to take your airplane in the canyon down, and it's not far, but if you're going to walk, you take Highway 24. Not far, but if you're going to walk, Highway 24. And you take it. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So, Highway 24 starts here in Leadville, right here. And if you take Highway 24 down, look what you pass. You pass, right here, a string town. Now, maybe that's a coincidence, but let's keep following Highway 24 down, because that's what I do in my solve. So, we keep going down Highway 24 here. And what do we pass? Not too far down the road, but a ball town. So here we have Highway 24 going through Stringtown, Ball Town, and ultimately right up through Toledo, Ohio. Highway 24 is too far to walk. And I think that's where I'll leave off for today. I'll go into the home of Brown and the following clues in the next video. But that's it for now.